Good morning, everyone. As we near the 60-day mark of our stay-at-home restrictions, my prayer is continually that God is blessing you and that you're able to use these circumstances to grow and mature in your faith with Christ. Ultimately, I think our personal objective should be that we strive to become fully devoted followers of Jesus Christ. And I hate to say it, but usually that only happens as we learn to deal with adversity in life. We live, obviously, in times of uncertainty, and the Bible warns us not to trust in things that are uncertain, particularly talks about uncertain riches. And I can think of no time in my lifetime where the uncertainty of money has become more evident, where we were in this economy that seemed to have no top to it. It was just growing with such rapidity, and then suddenly to have the brakes slammed on. It's like kind of going 100 miles an hour and then slamming on the brakes, and everybody feels like their face is up against the windshield. And when it all stops, we're just sitting here kind of stunned, trying to figure out, okay, what do we do now? It's interesting because even before all this happened, psychologists were warning, sociologists were warning that we're dealing with what they called an age of melancholy, that there was an epidemic, they said, of depression. So before we had an epidemic or a pandemic of COVID-19, we had another epidemic that was an emotional side where people were really feeling really despondent in their life and really wondering what the meaning and the purpose of life was. I mean, for the last 10 years, the suicide rate has gone up by 33%. I mean, that's a staggering number to think of it, that there are a third more suicides today than there were 10 years ago. But since the stay-at-home order has come in place, we find that domestic violence calls have gone up some 30%. Suicide hotlines said that their call ratios have increased by 338% as people are desperately trying to find a reason to hold it all together. And even when we find in our own relational dynamics where anger becomes an issue, I mean, my wife and I have had more angry words over these last 60 days than we probably had over the previous 60 months. And as I look at these outbursts of anger, I begin to realize that really what lies at the root of anger is depression. It's a sense of melancholy. And we kind of live in what's a perfect storm right now for a lot of emotional conflict. And I say that so that hopefully you'll recognize the fact that you're battling emotions doesn't mean that there's something particularly damaged or broken about you, although there's something damaged and broken about all of us. But nonetheless, you realize that this is a really kind of a coming together of various factors. In fact, we might call it a perfect storm. I mean, if you remember the movie by that name, it was the idea that there was this conflation of different elements of wind, weather, temperature, and so forth that brought together a storm that would be a storm of the century that led to the death of a lot of seamen. But the point is that we have these three things that are really kind of colliding right now. The first of all is just the reality of the pandemic with its own fear and its own threat. Even as we get further into the pandemic and know more about it, we're realizing that, yeah, there was a lot of things that we misunderstood. There certainly was a bit of hysteria in the beginning, and that was based upon a lot of false information coming out of not only the World Health Organization and out of China, but also we find now from the Imperial College out of London, where a lot of the predictions were based upon really falsified information, or at least faulty information. So we're beginning to kind of get to a place where I realize it's not as bad or as dangerous as we thought, except for certain populations, as we understand. But that has created its own stress. It's been stressful just dealing with that. But secondly, there's this thing called the social distancing that we're supposed to observe. And social distancing is really kind of another way of saying social isolation. And human beings aren't made for social isolation. And what we've done in our effort to try to bridge the gap between the internal loneliness that we feel as we take this giant leap into the digital world. And the digital world is an artificial world. It's a virtual reality. It has the appearance of being real. In other words, when you're on Snapchat or you're talking to somebody on FaceTime or in Zoom, it's like you're talking with them, but at the same time you're not. As we've talked about earlier, there's a kind of depression that just comes with that because we're missing out on a lot of what communication takes place on nonverbal levels. And so that's created a lot of difficulty. I mean, we start losing sight of who we are, and we begin to present ourselves in artificial ways that later on are hard to undo. It's kind of like your Facebook photo. Quite honestly, it probably doesn't look a lot like you. It's probably been photoshopped significantly or filtered in a way that makes you look younger and better and more capable than you actually are. But then there's a third thing, and I think that we don't realize this. As we begin to allow our liberties to become taken over by executive order, if you will, there's a sense of a loss of autonomy, that we become basically no longer single important people, that we're basically digits, and we live in a digital world, but we're evaluated by our statistical profile. And that leads us we become in a way kind of victims of the technocrats who tell us what we can do and what we cannot do. All of these things have a really painful effect upon most people and cause us to really begin to experience a degree of depression. And what's interesting is depression leads us to a feeling of helplessness. In fact, for years they tried to treat depression with therapy, and the Freudian analogy or analysis, which they find now all it did was reinforce people's depression as they looked more and more to themselves instead of outside of themselves. And so that's kind of gone by the wayside for the most part. And then you had the biomedical approach. Well, we'll give people medications, but all we find that did was it masked the true feelings, and they didn't really change their outlook or their perspective. There's a whole new approach now to basically saying you need to have a different perspective, that it's all about how you see the circumstances you're in. And as Christians, we should have a tremendous advantage in that regard. I mean, I'm thinking about the story of Esther, where basically Haman had persuaded the Persian king to command the genocide, the eradication of the Jewish people. And it looked so dire until the last moment. And I love the way it's put in chapter 9, verse 1 of Esther. It says, "On the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred." Another translation puts it the opposite, or the tables were turned and the Jews gained mastery over those who wanted to destroy them. Now, that just really struck me as I was reflecting on that, because so often we find that when God takes us through a difficult time, it can feel and look like it's a hopeless situation, and yet God has the ability to reverse something instantaneously. In a moment, he can change it. The diagnosis can be changed in a moment. The financial collapse can be reversed in a moment. There's just a number of ways in which God can speak into a situation, because the same God who created the heavens and the earth with his mouth is the same God who can speak reality and change over your situation. So I pray that you just really reflect on that today. And again, Esther chapter 9, verse 1, a memorable verse. The reverse occurred according to the English Standard Version. But it really speaks of that ability of God to transform our circumstances in a moment. So I'm out of time yet again. And so look forward to carrying on conversation with you tomorrow. Many blessings, and go in Jesus' grace.